Welcome to the new garden. I'm Judy Barrett. We're here at the Santa Clara Pueblo in New Mexico, visiting the home of Joel Glansberg and Roxanne Swinzel. They're experimenting with permaculture in their garden. Let's find out how permaculture works. We can all apply the principles in our gardens. Hi, Joel.
Hi, Judy.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Great. Tell us a little bit about what you've done here. I understand that your home and your garden is all an integrated system. How does that work? What is permaculture here?
Permaculture is trying to imitate nature, and in nature everything works together. So this courtyard works very much like a little canyon, so that in the south-facing side it's very warm and drier, and on the north-facing side it's cooler and moister, so we put plants that like those things in those different places. Our garden, everywhere we go, you'll see it looks kind of wild, and that's because nature works well together. And so we're trying to imitate the way things work in nature. When we first moved here and we were building the house, it was very bare. It was like a driveway. It had all been driven over and scraped. Where it wasn't totally bare, there were all kinds of weeds growing, but it was basically pretty trashed. Right where our house is in our yard, there were no trees or shrubs at all. The difference between the way it is now and what it was like is unbelievable. It was very bare, and now it's very lush and alive. And you can hear all the birds that are here that have moved in just because of what we've done. I'm very glad that Rox took the pictures before, when no one would believe the change that's happened here.
Tell me something about the philosophy that led you to build this home and garden.
Well, I should really introduce you to my wife, Roxanne, because she's had a lot to do with it, maybe even more than I have.
Hello, Roxanne?
Hi.
Joel tells me that the plan here is mostly yours. Tell us about your garden and your home and how you made the decisions to build it.
Well, I don't know if it's mostly mine, but I can tell you what our thoughts were about it.
Okay, that'd be great.
I think our main focus was to somehow create a home that sustained us and wasn't against nature and the environment, and that could be a beautiful place that we could live and eat and be happy in. For myself, I believe that if we learn how to do as much as we can ourselves, then the stronger we become inside. And one of our main points about our place is that we do it with our own hands and do it ourselves, because when people do things themselves, they feel empowered. They can go, I can do this. I know how to do this. And if they can do this amount, then they're more willing to try a little more and a little more until the world isn't so scary to them. They can do anything they put their mind to. And that's kind of what we want it to do. We want it to bloom. We want it to make a flowering tree come alive again.
Thanks, Roxanne. Let me catch up with Joel and look at the rest of your garden.
Okay, thank you for coming.
So how labor-intensive is this garden?
Now that everything's pretty well established, we don't spend very much time at all except in the spring planting and when we need to water things.
How do you get water into this little canyon?
Well, we use the hose some, but down in here in the bottom, we have what we call a swale. It's kind of like a little ditch or depression. And down at the base of the hill, our shower and tub water comes out and waters this area and helps to water all the trees and shrubs.
It runs in a pipe from under the house?
Yeah, you can see the bathtub through the window, and you can actually kind of see the pipe going through the wall. Then it goes underground and comes out, and it's like having a little natural spring in the courtyard. Mm-hmm. And then up here, where it's hotter, but it's also drier, we get the roof water in this gutter. It goes down a pipe and goes into a slotted pipe under the ground, and the water comes out and waters that bed when it rains. Part of what we try to do here is use not only the spaces on the ground, but also the vertical spaces. These cucumbers will train up the wall, so they'll take up less space. And that's partly what's happening with the grape. Also, in the summer, it will cover these windows and help keep the house cool. In the winter, we'll cut it back so the sun comes in and warms the house. One of the main things we think about is microclimates, which are places that are warmer or cooler than just out in the open. So as I already said, here we'll put the more heat-loving plants, and then on the north side of that wall, we'll put the more cool-loving plants and moisture-loving plants. And then also, because this is close to the house and obviously very intensive, we'll pick more productive plants and smaller plants. The fruit trees are mainly genetic dwarfs. Everything in here will be a cultivar. That means they'll be grafted, they'll be highly productive of high quality fruits. And as we go further out, you'll see that we're not so worried about quality of produce as hardiness. So they can take the more difficult areas where they don't get as much care. There's a number of native plants. There's a very beautiful penstemon in bloom right there now. And one thing that we do a lot is we use a lot of weeds. This here is called beeweed or clayome. There's a garden flower, which is a close relative. And this can be eaten as greens. You can cook it. And also the Anasazi pottery that you see, which is black on white, the black comes from boiling this plant down, so it's very high in iron. One of the most intensively planted areas probably is this wall that we'll do peas early on, and then when the peas are phasing out, we'll put in our tomato plants, and then the tomato plants we can start to plant our fall greens underneath. And we have done similar things here. Sometimes we'll plant early broccoli, and then we'll plant our tomatoes or peppers amongst them, and the tomatoes will help to shade the broccolis because they'll like it cooler. We don't have too many weed problems in our established areas. The way we've gone is a little piece at a time. A small area is less intimidating than a big area. And so we've broken everything up into small areas and gotten them to the point where they're self-maintaining for the most part. And then we move on to another area. And we found that to be the most successful way to go, rather than trying to do everything at once.
Let me ask you about the bees. What do they contribute to the garden?
Well, obviously they pollinate, which helps increase the yield of fruit, and also honey and wax. But I think they also just make things sort of lively. They're interesting to watch, and even I like to hear them buzz.
Yeah.
If we walk out this way, we could see an area that we're just starting to work on some more.
Okay, well, let's do that.
So this is an area that we're just starting to bring a little more into production. And we laid down, first we covered it with some cow manure, and then we've laid straw on top. You want to use straw rather than hay so it doesn't contain weed seeds or grass seeds. The hay is nice because you can break the bales down into flakes, and when you lay them down, they smother the weeds and the grass more readily. You can see right here it's very wet because this pipe here is where the water from our washing machine comes out.
I see. Do you use regular detergent in your washing machine?
No, you have to be careful that what you're using is gentle. Actually, a lot of detergents contain heavy metals, and so you don't want that. You don't want to use chlorine bleach, although non-chlorine bleach is fine. You don't want to use things like fabric softeners or anything like that.
I see.
This is called rape. It's a oilseed crop, but it also is a green, which is quite nice, and partly it's planted sort of as a cover crop and to establish something here.
Do you plant seeds or plants?
I just broadcast the seed, but planted in amongst here, you can see there's an artichoke, which will like the moisture, and there's a few tomato plants in around there. The first thing we did with this whole area was we started to sort of sculpt it to maintain the water, and we made swales there again. When it rains, the water, which would normally wash off in sheet flow, is caught in the swales and soaks in. So that's where we start planting. And also we're lucky enough to have an acequia, so we have ditch water, and we also use the swales to water with the acequia.
I see. What is the acequia?
An acequia is just an irrigation ditch. The water comes from the stream, which is over there where the cottonwoods are. The things along it get watered, and then we'll start to plant. We'll go out from there. What we're always doing is trying to find a spot where we have water or nutrients, concentrate our efforts there, and then move out from there. We made these swales, and we planted many trees and shrubs along them, and then we're starting to work on the ground covers, whether it be annuals or perennial wildflowers. We tend to mix things up. This is really kind of funny here, but this is a native sorrel, which is an edible green that's sort of taken over this pear tree.
It's huge, yes.
I think it just likes the laundry water. That's a peach. You can see it's covered with peaches. And again, this is a use of microclimate. We're on the sort of east-northeast side of the house. So it's going to be cooler here. It doesn't get as much sun. So the peaches, here's one, and there's one over there, and one against this wall. And this almond, all will tend to bloom too early in the spring and get frosted and lose their blossoms. So by being here, they'll be shaded and cooler, so they'll bloom later and will tend to escape late spring frosts. It sort of goes against immediate intuition, but it starts to make some sense. And also the hill, the cold air will drain down the hill, and that will help protect the trees as well. One of the main things we did across this whole area is planted legumes, both traditional ones, like this is alfalfa, which we just broadcast seed, and it's also a bee plant. You can see the flower. And we'll cut this and spread it as mulch to help build up the soil.
I see.
And it's fixing nitrogen in the ground by root associates. And another less known plant like this is this, which is called the Siberian pea shrub. And it's in the same family as the alfalfa or the peas or beans.
It's planted from seed?
These were planted from shrubs. There's a number of these throughout the yard. The black locusts are also fixing nitrogen. You see them in flower. Things like Russian olives and autumn olives, which you can also eat the fruit of. This will also provide bird forage and can also be eaten like peas by people. They're called pioneer species. They in nature are going to be the first species to come in to help build the soil, and they tend to be very hardy. They'll take drought, and they'll also take poor soil conditions.
These pioneer plants, do you leave them in for a certain amount of time and then take them out, or how do you know when they've done their job?
Well, what we've done and what works quite well is to start to plant underneath them. You can use them as nurse plants. Maybe plant a fruit tree or a shrub. Just here we have problems with too much sun drying things out or killing things, so we'll plant just on the north side of them or the east side of them. And some plants like to be understory, such as currants and gooseberries. One thing we've started to do now that our Russian olives have gotten big enough is to plant our tomato plants right underneath the Russian olives, and they'll make use of the good soil, and they'll also get some frost protection in the late fall.
But they'll still get enough sun?
But they'll get enough sun if the tree is pruned up and they're planted on the south side.
I see. Well, you've showed us the new area and the intensively planted area. What other areas are there in the garden?
We have another vegetable garden, and we also have a traditional corn and bean field we can look at.
Well, let's look at it.
Okay.
Here's another feature that sort of combines the garden and the house. What is this?
Well, this is called a cold frame, and we have a clear cover that fits on it during the winter, and we grow all our salad greens in there all winter, and you can see they're all going to seed now. And this time of year, we usually take the cover off, and we'll often clear it out and put things like melons or other heat-loving plants in there.
What is this garden here?
Well, this garden we had the turkeys in here all winter. And this is another area that's really just sort of coming into its own. We fence the chickens into different areas, and they'll scratch it up, and they'll fertilize it. And then Roxanne made these waffles. It's a traditional way of holding moisture in arid regions by making the walls raised rather than the soil where you're planting. The moisture's held in the soil. And
So the chickens do your fertilizing and your cultivating.
Right.
And then you shape the beds to capture the water.
Right.
Yeah. But you have trees growing in your vegetable garden. That seems unusual. So many times people think vegetable gardens have to be flat, straight out in the sun, no trees.
Well, here, particularly because we have so much sunlight and we have high altitude, that most plants don't mind a little bit of shade. And also, anytime you have a cover over your plants, it will help protect them from frost. So over here, you can see the tomato plants underneath the Russian olive. And the Russian olive is one of those pioneers that we planted several years ago. It's been fixing nitrogen and dropping its leaves and making the soil there more fertile. And so now we've planted some tomatoes under it to make use of the fertility and the protection.
Do you have to redig these beds every year, or do you just replace the plants?
We tend not to dig things. We tend to let earthworms and other things like that do the cultivating. And the trees and things are doing the same thing, and deep-rooted annuals like carrots or radishes will do the same. Well, this is a more traditional garden, particularly in the Southwest. This is watered from the acequia, and it's made so that the water can flow through these ditches, and then each will be blocked up and the water will flow down. And these are all traditional crops, corn and beans and chilies. In this area, we had no intention of making it into a garden at first, and so we had planted some of these pioneer species and some mulberries, which are still here. And then my wife, Roxanne, came up with the idea of making this into a garden area. So we brought the water around the house, and we started to bring in manure and some rotten sawdust and planting cover crops. And so over about 3 or 4 years, it started to become a fairly productive area.
These are chilies, right?
Right. These are a local native chili, and these are a Hopi lima bean. They're a really good dry bean. They seem to resist the bean beetles, and also they're our favorite bean to eat.
They're a bush bean?
Yes. They run a little bit, but you certainly don't need to put up poles.
And the chilies, you start them from seed in the garden, or you?
Well, these we started from transplants. We started them in our little greenhouse, but you certainly could do them from seed. Over here is a potato bed. We have problems with gophers. And so our potatoes planted in the ground, the gophers tend to eat. So we were trying to figure out how we could avoid that problem. We had heard of people planting in baskets in sawdust or straw, and we thought about using straw bales to make a bed. So we laid down some chicken wire so the gophers couldn't get up into it, and got some well-rotted sawdust and some manure. And as these plants grow, we'll build up the straw bales and fill it up with sawdust. So in the end, to harvest, we'll just pull it apart and pull out the potatoes.
Is this your main source of food? Do you grow enough to live on all year long, or is that your goal?
Well, it's more sort of to see how much we can get. It's more sort of an experiment, and it changes from year to year. Some years we've grown all of our beans and certainly all of our corn. We have to buy dairy products, obviously, or most of our meat. Things like wheat, we're just starting to learn about. In the other garden, you'll see we're growing some wheat. And any of our oils we have to buy, but most of our vegetables, and we're getting more and more of our crops that we're growing ourselves. So it's sort of a challenge to see how much you can grow on 3/4 of an acre of X driveway.
This is a beautiful patio area. You have grapevines growing on the arbor. Does this work with your plan for the house and the garden?
Well, again, this is an example of using the plants for double purpose. Obviously, they're producing fruit for us, and they'll shade these west windows in the summer when they're picking up too much sun and the house would otherwise overheat. But we can cut them back in the fall and the sun will come in and warm the house.
Mm-hmm. And what is this in the corner?
Well, this is called an horno in Spanish. It's a traditional adobe oven, and you can bake a lot of bread in it by making a fire in it, a small quick fire, and it will actually bake bread in about 20 minutes rather than closer to an hour in your oven.
And here's another garden with even more kinds of plants growing in it. I see peas. What else is growing in this garden?
Well, we have some sweet corn that's just coming up now and a lot of tomatoes. And you can see right ahead of you is some winter wheat that's just starting to head up. And this is part of us trying different things to see what we can grow. There's a couple patches of it. This was planted last August, and it's just starting to head up now. Again, it's made in waffles to hold the water.
Uh-huh.
And this is irrigated by the acequia, and the water will come down here and hit this gate so that this waffle will be flooded, and then we'll take that gate out and put it back here, and the next bed will be flooded. In this way we can use mulch, and we don't have to turn the soil so much as in the garden which has the furrows.
Do you use any kind of pesticides, chemical fertilizers, anything like that in your garden?
No, we just use mulch and manure basically for fertility, and by crop rotation and such complex interplanting we seem to avoid most pest problems. Our worst pests are grasshoppers, and the turkeys, which roam around free sometimes, take care of them pretty effectively.
But you have to keep them in certain areas at certain times, right?
The
You don't
turkeys-
want them in the garden when you have young seedling plants out.
Well, the turkeys are much better than the chickens in that turkeys don't scratch, and chickens will scratch things up. So they're good for different things.
I see.
Chickens would be ideal in an orchard, and turkeys tend to not disturb things too much. When the tomatoes are ripe and red, they'll stomp the tomatoes down, but until then, they really won't do much damage.
Stomp them down. They don't eat them?
They'll be going for the tomatoes, but being related to dinosaurs, they'll just crush the plants.
See. Well, you've done such a beautiful job. How did you know how to do this?
Well, I took a few classes from a man named Bill Mollison who came up with all this permaculture stuff, and then a lot was just educating myself, because a lot of this has been done mostly in the tropics and subtropics where they have a much easier climate than here in the high desert.
Did you feel like that you knew instinctively that you should do something besides plant grass in your lawn, or how'd you reach that decision?
Well, I think it came to me over a lot of time. I had done a lot of native landscaping and things with traditional crops in the Southwest, and it came real clear from a lot of things that Bill said, one of the main things being that we're the only creatures on the planet that make our environment less hospitable rather than more hospitable. In most people's yards, you couldn't survive off of anything there. And rabbits and all kinds of grazing animals will increase the graze in the area by grazing it back so it'll grow again, like pruning. Birds will plant a lot of the plants that they'll eat from simply by dropping their seeds all over. And only in recent history have we gotten into this idea of landscaping, which really comes from the nobility in Europe. People used to have food in their gardens, but then it was a sign of wealth that you didn't need to grow your food. And so we've sort of taken off on that, and this is sort of a way of getting back to people providing for their own needs where they live, rather than trashing where they live and then trashing another area growing their food there as well. So it's a way that we can use less of the planet so there's more room for others. By working with nature, it makes it easier. And although aesthetics is not one of the main things we're aiming for, I've never seen an ugly natural area. So if we're trying to imitate nature, I think it just is beautiful because it works.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing your garden with us, Joel. It's amazing to see what you've done with this 3/4 of an acre. It's good to know that permaculture can work in even the most difficult circumstances.
Thank you for coming.
I'm sure we've all learned things today about permaculture that we can use in our own gardens. Diversity, working with nature rather than against her. I'm Judy Barrett. Join me again next week for The New Garden.
For your own videocassette copy of today's program, or any one of the 64 other programs in the New Garden Natural Gardening series, call 1-800-238-6666. Each videocassette is $24.95, including postage and handling. Visa and MasterCards are accepted. Check or money orders may be mailed to the address on the screen.